Hello, everyone. Hello. Welcome to Daf Yomi Week in Review. It is lovely to see you all this Thursday. It is 9:30 a.m. for me on the East Coast, but it may not be that time for you. I'm Rachel Scheinerman. I edit My Jewish Learning and a Daily Dose of Talmud. And this is, of course, the once weekly Daf Yomi Lightning Review that we do on Thursday mornings, where we look back at some highlights of the last 7 Dafim. And we are joined this morning by Dr. Yardaena Osband, and I think we are all assembled. So please go ahead.
Okay, if you can just give me, I can share my screen. Okay, great. So thanks everybody. I always love learning with you. I wanted to go through 2 passages that I think sort of exemplify some of what's going on here with Bava Batra. One is going to be at the end of Parak Bet, of the second Parak, and then we're also going to kick off the beginning of the 3rd Parak together. So we have this very interesting Mishnah here at the end of the 2nd Parak that reads as following. So we know that part of what the 2nd parak is discussing, the 2nd chapter, is what's the distance between certain types of property or objects have to be, because if they're too close together, they will cause some type of damage. So I like to think of this parak as it's kind of like building code in Talmudic times, right? It's telling us how do we build structures, pits, walls, houses, all of these types of things. And so this Mishnah is talking about certain facilities that you would have or certain things that you would do. How close can it be to a city because of the issue of odor, right? Like we know if you live near anybody here lives near a garbage facility, right? It smells. So the Talmud here is telling us, the Mishnah here is telling us that there are certain things, right? Animal carcasses, graves, and a tannery that have to be at least 50 amot from the city. Okay? Enosim Borski Elul Mizracha here. The Mishnah goes on to say that a tannery can only be established on the east side of the city. And the idea is because the east side wind is a very soft wind and it won't blow odors in. There's no chance of it, or it lessens the chance of it blowing any type of odor into the city. Rabbi Akiva Omer L'chol ruach hu oseh chutz mima'arava. Rabbi Akiva says that you can build it on any side except for the west side of a town. Umarchik 50 amah. And when you do build it, it still needs that distance of 50 amot. Umarchikin at hamishra min hayerek. And then finally, the end here is that it says that you have to distance vegetables and water from flax water. Okay, ve'eta krishin min habitzalim, and leeks from onions, ve'eta chardal min hadvarim, and mustard seeds from bees. And the idea is that these are things that can damage the other things. So that if you grow leeks too close to onions, it will damage the onions. If you grow mustard seeds next to the bees will eat them and it will hurt the bees. But Rabbi Yossi matir b'chardar. Rabbi Yossi says that actually you can plant mustard seeds near the bees. The reason the Gemara explains is that both of them damage each other because the bees chew the leaves of the mustard plant. And so they're sort of like, it's mutual destruction on both sides. Okay. Now, what the Gemara does from here is fascinating, right? First it says, Ibailahu, Rabbi Akiva Hechi Ka'amar, okay? So what case is Rabbi Akiva talking about here? L'chol ruach hu oseh v'someh chutz mima'arava. Right? Did he mean to say that somebody can put a tannery on any side of the city, and you can even place a tannery close to the city, except for the west side, where you have to be, at least 50 cubits away? Meaning, when he says you can put a tannery on any side, does he mean to say it can be closer than 50 amot? But if you're going to put it on the west side, it must be at least 50 amot apart. Or is he saying you can do it on the north side or east side, but it has to be 50 amot, except for the west side where you can't put it at all. All right, and now it says, Toshma. So they say, come and learn. They quote a brisa here to try to prove what Rabbi Akiva is talking about. The Tanya, we learned in a brisa, Rabbi Akiva Omer. Rabbi Akiva says, L'chol ruach hu oseh umarchik 50 amah. You can put a tannery on any side of a city with a distance of 50 amot, chutz mima'arava de'ena oseh kol ikar, except for the west side where you can never put a tannery. Why? Mipnei shehi tedira, because it is frequent. Now, we've seen this concept of tadir before. This is a very famous concept. We see it a lot in Masechet Brachot. Tadir v'sheino tadir, tadir kodem, okay? The idea being that if something is more frequent, we do that thing first, okay? So for example, let's say we have competing, like it's the time to say mincha, and let's say you didn't say musaf yet, okay? So the idea is you would say mincha first before you say musaf, because which tefillah, which prayer is more tadir? Mincha. We say mincha every day. Musaf, we only say, when it's Rosh Chodesh or when it's a holiday. So that's kind of the concept of tadir. We've seen it before in that way. Here the question is, what is tadira? What is the explanation of this mean? So Amar le Rava le Rav Nachman, my tadira. So Rava says to Rav Nachman, what does tadira mean in this context? So we say that in Marava, it's tadira. Ilmale tadira beruchot, right? So maybe we say that it means it's frequent among the winds, meaning the west wind, it blows all the time. Vaha Amar Rav Hanan bar Abba Amar Rav. So didn't Rav Hanan bar Abba say in the name of Rav, Arba ruchot minashvot b'chol yom. There are 4 winds that blow every day, right? In all the 4 different directions, north, south, east, west. Ruach tzfonit im kulan. But the north one blows with all of them. Because if it were not so, if that north wind didn't always blow, the world would not exist for 1 hour. Okay, the idea is that the northern wind is supposed to be a nicer wind, and it sort of balances out the harshness of the other winds. The southern wind is the harshest wind. Okay, and were it not for an angel, this is an angel called Ben Nates, okay, which stops it from blowing even harder, it would have destroyed the whole world. Shene'emar, and so they quote here a pasuk from Eo, from Job chapter 39, verse 26, that says, Habibintcha yaver Nates yifrosh kenafav l'teman. Right? Does the hawk, the Nate, soar by her wisdom and stretch her wings towards the south? So this shows that the northern wind is the most constant, not the western wind. So the point here is that if we want to say that the western wind is the most frequent, here we have the statement with Rav that basically teaches us it's the northern wind that's the most frequent, and therefore it can't be that that's what Rabbi Akiva means when he says tadira. Elamai tadira. So what could tadira mean? Tadira b'shchina. And I think this is an amazing passage, okay? Because here we are talking about what looks like Jewish law, and look where the Gemara goes to in its discussion of this particular Mishnah, right? It means frequency with the divine presence, right? So the concept of the Shekhinah is it's the manifestation of God's presence in this world, right? Like we say when it describes the Mishkan being built in the Torah, right? V'shachanti b'tocham, that God says God will dwell within the within the Mishkan, or later in the Beit HaMikdash. So the idea of the Shekhinah, the idea of dwelling, is that we say there's some sort of presence of God that dwells in this world. And so to Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, Bo v'nachzik tova la'avotenu, shehodia mekom tefillah dichtiv utzva shamayim lecha mishtachavim. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi teaches us, come and let us be grateful to our ancestors. What he means here by the ancestors are Anshe Knesset Hagdola. So Anshe Knesset Hagdola was the generation that came right at the end of when prophecy started to wind down. They're established by the period of time of Ezra and Nehemiah, right, which is the period of time that we call the Shivat Zion, which is the return to Zion after 70 years of the Babylonian exile, when Cyrus said that we could go back and rebuild a second temple. And we move from a prophecy-centered religion to a sort of more a leadership-based religion. And that becomes the Anshe Knesset Hagdola. The Gemara tells us that there were 120 people in it. One of the questions is, was it 120 people in total, or was it 120 people throughout the years? In other words, it was always a governing body of 120 people. And this basically goes through most of the Second Temple period, because we say in Pirkei Avot, in the second Mishnah of Pirkei Avot, that Shimon HaTzadik, who was one of the high priests in the Second Temple, he was the best high priest in the Second Temple, He was Misha'aret Anshe Knesset Hagdola. He was the remnant. He was the end of Anshe Knesset Hagdola. Okay. And so what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi does is he quotes a pasuk here from Nehemiah that says, "And the hosts of heaven bow down to you." So the idea is, since we know, right, that like the sun and the moon, right, things rise in the east and they set in the west, that the idea is that when they set in the west, they're bowing to the west. So when it says the hosts of heaven bow down to you, since they bow down to you in the west, that means that the divine presence must be in the west. So, okay, I think this is like very interesting. So this is Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi's opinion and seems to be Rabbi Akiva's opinion, that the divine presence seems to be limited. Okay, think about what this is saying. It's pretty amazing. Limited to the west. Matkivla Rav Acha bar Yaakov. So Rav Acha bar Yaakov objects to this. Vidilma ke'evet shenotel prasmu rabo v'chozer la'acharav umishtachaveh kashya. So Rav Acha bar Yaakov says, no. Why are we saying that the celestial bodies bow westward, right? Shouldn't we say that this is like a servant who leaves his master and he sort of walks backwards and bows, right? So in other words, think about it the way that like if you're at the kotel, right? You know, the way that we walk backwards and sort of bow a little bit because we don't want to turn our back towards God. So this would be the same idea. So if this were the case, it would seem that the presence of God would be where? The Shekhinah should be in the east. And so the Gemara says, Kasha, right? This verse, this pasuk that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi brings, it's not a conclusive proof because maybe you could say that it should be in the east instead. Now we're going to have a different opinion, okay? But Rabbi Yoshia Savar, Shechina b'chol makom. Rabbi Yoshia says, and I think this is the one that most of us probably hold by. I think especially those of you who know who Uncle Moishi is, a famous Jewish singer who has that famous song, Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere, right? So I think that's what the concept of Shekhinah or the concept of God's presence in this world that most of us grow up with, right? The Shekhinah is everywhere. Everywhere you look, God's presence is there. The Amar Rabbi Yoshia, and so Rabbi Yoshia says, my dichtiv, okay? What is the meaning of the pasuk? Okay, and again, he's quoting a pasuk from Nehemiah. It's the same pasuk, chapter 9, verse 6. Ataku Hashem levadecha, ata asita et hashamayim. You are the Lord. You, even you alone, you have made the heavens, right? And then the continuation of the pasuk is what we read before. Shluchecha lo keshulchei basar v'dam. Okay, your messengers are not like the messengers of flesh and blood. Shulchei basar v'dam mimakom shemishtalchim l'shem machzirim shilchutam. Right, messengers of flesh and blood, they return to the place from where they were sent on their mission. Aval, right? Aval shulchecha, right? But your messengers, meaning the celestial bodies, lemakom shemishtalchim misham machzirim shilchutam. Right, from their mission, from the very same place which they were sent. Your messengers returned from their mission from the same place with which they were sent. Shenemar hatishalech berakim ve'elecha v'yamru lecha hinenu. And here he quotes a pasuk from Eov, chapter 38, verse 35, which says, "Can you send forth lightnings that they may not go out and say to you, how are we?" Okay. The point is by saying Yavo v'yomru lo namar ela v'yelechu v'yomru milamed shashchina b'chol makom. The fact that the verse does not say they will come and say, meaning they do not return to the point of where they left, but they say they may go out and say, teaches us that the divine presence is found in every place. So essentially what he does is he takes this pasuk of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, adds this pasuk of Eov, right, gives this distinction between where it doesn't say they will come and say, which seems to say, right, that they may go out and say to you, here we are, right? But instead they say they may go out and say, not they will come and say, they may go out and say. It teaches us that the Shekhinah can be found anywhere, okay? And so I think Rabbi Yoshia is doing something very clever. He's saying, okay, I have this pasuk of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, right? We gave a good kasha against it, right? Rabbi Abahu came and gave a good reason why maybe it's not in the West. I'm going to take this pasuk, use another pasuk in Eov, and I'm going to show you why actually it shows that the Shekhinah is everywhere. And then from here, the Gemara is going to bring other. So Rabbi Yoshia is a Mora, and now they're going to bring other opinions to show other people who agree that the Shekhinah is everywhere. So we go to Rabbi Yishmael, who's a Tana. Ba'af Rabbi Yishmael savar Shekhinah b'chol makom. Rabbi Yishmael also agrees that the Shekhinah can be and is everywhere. The Tana debate Rabbi Yishmael, because this was the following brisa was taught in the yeshiva of Rabbi Yishmael. Minayin sheshchina b'chol makom. How do we know that the Shekhinah is everywhere? Shenemar hinei hamalach hadaber biyotzei umalach acher yotzei likrato. So here they're quoting a pasuk from Zechariah chapter 2 verse 7 that says, "And behold, the angel who spoke with me went forth, and another angel went out to meet him." Okay, so the idea is both angels were coming from the divine presence, right? One went out, went out from him. One comes out to meet him. So the idea here is acharav lo ne'amar ela likrato milamed sheshchina b'chol makom, right? It says to meet him, right? It's it doesn't say after him, but it says to meet him, which means to say that the Shekhinah is everywhere, because it seems that the angels from this pasuk are leaving from different locations. So it means the divine presence is everywhere. The Rav Sheshet says Bar Shekhinah b'chol makom. Now this one is fascinating. So Rav Sheshet was blind, okay? And there's a lot of different discussion about the fact that Rav Sheshet is blind. One of the famous discussions about Rav Sheshet is the fact that he was blind and kept all the mitzvot. Does he get more of a reward for that or less of a reward for that because he didn't have to keep the mitzvot because he was blind? Here we have another little anecdote about Rav Sheshet and the fact that he was blind. We know that Rav Sheshet felt that the Shekhinah was everywhere. The Amar le Rav Sheshet lishmaye, right? Rav Sheshet said to his attendant, okay, or his servant, l'chol ruchata ukman. You can, when I stand up to pray, right? He doesn't know where he's facing. So the attendant would help him to face in a direction. And so the instruction he gives him is he says, I can face any direction, levar mi mizrach, except I don't want to face east. V'la mishum deles be'shchina, el mishum demoru be'mine. It's not because the divine presence isn't in the east, but because the heretics tell people, right, that they should pray eastward. And I don't want anyone to think that I'm a heretic or that I believe in what the heretics say. So the point of Rav Sheshet's statement, what we learn from this is the Shekhinah is everywhere. You could face any direction, but I don't want to look like a mean. I don't want to look like a heretic. So don't face me in the east. It's a great proof. It's not a proof based on a pasuk. It's a proof based on action. And finally, Rabbi Aval Omer Shekhinah b'ma'arav. Rabbi Aval says that the divine presence is actually in the west. The Amar Rabbi Avahu, because he says, my Oriah. What is the meaning of the word Oriah, which is a name for the west? Avirya, right? It means the air of God. And so this would mean the place of the west. That's why it's called Oriah, the west, because it's the place of God, okay? This was the first section that I wanted to learn with all of you. I think it is a masterful piece of Gemara, right? Here we take this Mishnah, which basically, if you were just to read the Mishnah by itself, like if somebody just did Mishnayos by themselves, and they say, okay, you read the simple Mishnah that says, you can't hang carcasses or have a graveyard or a tannery so close to a city. It seems like Rabbi Akiva disagrees with this a little bit. And yet the Gemara uses this as an opportunity to have a very deep sort of metaphysical discussion on where is the placement of the Shekhinah, and that the motivation for Rabbi Akiva's learning that it only can be in, that it cannot be in the West is because we have to respect where the divine presence actually is. Now, Rabbi Akiva can have this opinion because he holds that it's only in the West. If you're somebody who holds that the Shekhinah is everywhere, right, it's going to have to be somewhere. And so I think part of what this discusses for me as well is the idea is that we know there are things in the world that is sort of not nice, right? Like a bathroom, for example. Like I think when you think about it sometimes, when you say like God is everywhere, the idea that you go to the bathroom in front of God actually is, it's kind of disgusting to think about. So I think there's a utility in Rabbi Akiva's opinion, which is supported by Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, because by limiting, right, the divine presence in a way, even though I think for most of us, we like, of course we want to say the Shekhinah is everywhere, but actually making a limitation of it sort of allows us to constrict where do we put sort of some of these activities that I think we would say would seem unseemly to do in front of the divine presence. Now, one question I had in this Gemara, which I did not have time to look up, is, and I've never seen it before, is there any discussion about not putting other things in the West because of this idea of the Shekhinahs there, right? Like, should you not have a bathhouse in the West or a bathroom in the West, right? That would sort of be my natural question based on this. But my point is that I think I want to emphasize that as much as Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shua ben Levi's opinion seems somewhat limiting, I think it also shows a certain respect to the Shekhinah in the world, and it allows sort of us to balance in a way some of the human activities that we have to do in order to sort of function in the world by giving a little bit of a limitation of where we can find God. Because then we could say, like, I don't do that where I know that the Shekhinah is. We're saying that the Shekhinah is everywhere, almost in a way feels a little bit overwhelming. No activity escapes the divine presence. Okay, that was the first passage that I wanted to show. While I move to the second one, I'll check if anybody has any comments or anything like this. Okay, so Lynn says here, okay, sorry, Brian goes on to say, if modern meteorologists checked out these points about the wind, yes, there's a lot of discussion in the commentators. Does this actually, vibe with modern science? But this is sort of a scientific approach to, this is Gemara science. Lynn says here, I love that even though the rabbis appear to be discussing mundane aspects of daily communal life, awareness of the divine is never far from their minds. The discussion of the Shekhinah into the discussion was lovely. Haha, thank you, Rob. That's a great pun here, right? You could say that it's a breeze. Okay, that is a good joke. And anybody have any actual questions here? Okay, so we will go on now to this next section. Okay, so this is actually the beginning of Perek Gimel that I wanted to go through. Okay, why is this not? Give me a second for it to load. So Perek Gimel is the third chapter, is a very famous chapter, which has to do with the concept of chazaka, okay? It's how do we assume ownership of property? Now, you can have a deed that you can prove, right? You could say, I made a sale, here's a deed. But I think the idea here is that there's much less of a paper trail, right? The way that we have today, okay? Like today, you would have a deed, you would register your sale with the town, right? To show that there was a transference of deed. These things did not really exist in the time of the Gemara, okay? And so we have the following here. Cheskat habatim, right? This is the first Mishnah of this chapter, right? When it comes to presumptive ownership of houses, v'haborod and pits, v'hashichin and ditches, v'hame'arod and caves, v'hashovachot and dovecots, v'hamirchsaot and bathhouses, ubeit habadin and olive presses, ubeit hashilchin and irrigated fields, va'avadim and slaves, v'kol shehu oseh peirot tadir, anything that generates profit. That's what peirot means here. It doesn't mean fruit, but in other words, anything that generates some types of profit. Tadir chazkatan shalosh shanim miyom liyom. Okay, there now again we have that word tadir again. Okay, their ownership is established by working or profiting from them for 3 years from day to day. Okay, so that is the idea. So the Mishnah basically presents this idea that somehow the way that you establish ownership is within 3 years. Okay, chazaka is so, and we see this in other ways that chazaka, chazaka is related to 3. Okay, sadeh ba'al. Okay, when it comes to a non-irrigated field, meaning a field that's watered by rain and therefore will only produce produce at certain times over the year, right? It doesn't have produce all during the year. Chazkata shalosh shanim ve'eno ve'enan miyom liyom. Okay, again, it's 3 years, but it doesn't have to be a constant 3 years. It doesn't have to be a full day-to-day during those 3 years, because those fields are not worked and harvested continually during those 3-year period. Rabbi Yishmael omer shloshosh chodeshim barishona, v'shlosha ba'achrona, u'shneim-asar chodesh be'emtza harei shmona-asar chodesh. Okay, so now different Tanaim are going to come and explain what does this mean. So according to Rabbi Yishmael, it means 3 months of possession in the first year, 3 months in the last year, a full 12 in the middle year. So you just need 18 months for these types of field, for a non-irrigated field. Rabbi Akiva omer chodesh barishona, v'chodesh ba'achrona, u'shneim asar chodesh be'emtza, harei arba'a asar chodesh. So Rabbi Akiva says that it needs to be a month in the first year, a month in the last year, and 12 months in the middle year, for a total of 14 months. Amar Rabbi Yishmael, so then Rabbi Yishmael says, Bamed Dvarim Amarim, what case are we talking about the 18 months? Bisadeh Lavan, Abalsta Ilan, Knas et Tfuato. So we're talking about a white field. That's what he means by Sedet Lavan, which means a grain field. But when it comes to a field of trees, once he gathered his produce and then harvested his olives and again gathered his figs. In other words, he did 3 types of harvests within this field, right? Kanas tuato masek zetav kanas kaitzo hare elu shalosh shanim. This is an equivalent to having possessed the field for 3 years. So this would be even less, right? This could all be done theoretically within less than a year's period of time, right? So here we just think you need 3 of something. Okay, what the Gemara does from here is it wants to know what's the source of 3 years. And so they're going to start with the machlokas of Rabbi Yochanan and the rabbis. Now, I'm not going to have time to read all of this because we're almost out of time here, okay? So I'll just go through it a little bit out of the depth. Rabbi Yochanan basically says that we learn the concept of 3 of Cheskat Shalosh Shanim from Mishor Mu'ad, right? So this takes us all the way back to Bava Kama, right? Which talks about the forewarned ox, right? The ox that we say, every ox starts off as an ox, a short tam, right? And then if an ox gores 3 times, it moves over into Shor Mu'ad. In other words, we know that this is an ox that has a tendency that we presume that it's going to hurt people, okay? So he says that you learn it from Shor Mu'ad. Just as when if it gores 3 times, right, it moves from a chazaka of tam to a chazaka of Mu'ad. The same thing here. If you work a land, right, for 3 years, right, then it leaves the possession of the seller and it goes to the possession of the buyer, okay? That is basically the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. The rabbis later on, there's a lot of discussion about that. The rabbis later on in 28b, right, they come to the opinion of the rabbis, right, Rabbanan Mai, okay, who hold that it has to be 3 years, right? They basically prove that Rabbi Yochanan agrees with Rabbi Yishmael that it could be 3 harvests. It doesn't have to be 3 years. The rabbis hold it has to be 3 years and not 3 harvests. And then they basically go to, how do we know that it's 3 years? And they bring a very interesting proof here, and then I'll wrap up. From Yirmiyahu, chapter 32, verse 44, Amar Rav Yosef Kraktiv. There's a pasuk here that says, Sadot bakesef yiknu, v'kato b'sever v'chatom. Okay, so it's talking about a field, okay, that was the purchase of a field from somebody named Hanamel by Yirmiyahu, his cousin, during the time of the siege of Eretz Yisrael. And it says, men shall buy fields for money, subscribe the deeds, and seal them. So the idea here is it describes the writing of a bill of a sale to show proof of ownership, because since he was told that he was going to be exiled, right? Okay, that he wasn't going to be able to establish living there for 3 years to actually show proof of ownership. And so therefore, right, Shaharei Navi Omed Be'eso Umashir Alachad Esrei, because Yirmiyahu stood in the 10th year of Tzidkiyahu's reign and warned the people to write bills of sale for the 11th year, because that's when Eretz Yisrael was going to be overrun. And therefore, they would only be able to live in the land in that land year 10 of the reign of Tzidkiyahu, year 11, but they wouldn't make it to a 3rd year, okay? Because Tzidkiyahu was going to be, his reign would end, the Galut is going to begin, and therefore you wouldn't be able to establish ownership. So the fact that you needed a deed shows that that was in place of having ownership over 3 years. And these are the 2 different opinions of Rabbi Yochanan versus the rabbis of how do we establish ownership and what is the source for it. Now, I think it's interesting to see what they do here. Rabbi Yochanan uses another halachic example, right? Which is a very Gemara type of way of doing this, where Rabbi Yochanan says, okay, let me see if I can find a parallel halacha to say that this is the source for it. Whereas the rabbis say, no, we're going to have a pasuk here that's going to prove it. The other thing I want to point out about the 2 passages that I read for you is they are a little bit unusual in Bava Batra. One of the things that's interesting about Bava Batra is there actually is not a lot of text sources, right? What we're going to see from here is the rest of this chapter is basically cases. It's going to be like, this claimant said this, that I own this house. The occupant said, no, I own it. They give an exchange of why one says it's in their possession, why one says it's in their possession. And then it gives the rabbi who basically says, no, this is why it's actually mine. And I think you'll see on page 31 that essentially the Gemara comes out to basically say the rabbis are the ones who could decide these cases because they're very difficult cases to actually decide. So I really want to point out here that it's the exception in Bava Batra when we see verses being used. One of the things that's very unusual about Bava Batra is it seems to be much more rabbinic reasoning as opposed to using the proof text. So I hope we see from this roundup that we did sort of the breadth of what gets discussed in the Gemara, right? We can have a very simple Mishnah that actually leads us to a very metaphysical discussion. And that here we'll have a chapter that starts off with, keep this in mind as we finish up the third chapter, that starts off with text proof, but that really the rest of this chapter is just going to be rabbinic reasoning, and it's not actually going to be I'm using verses to prove what the law actually should be. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm sorry that we went a little bit over, but we started a little bit late. I will check the chat now for any questions or comments. Okay, somebody voted for this.
That was exactly the kind of wrap up I was going to give. So you.
Oh, okay, great.
I don't even have to, but I think you brought just such a wonderful and interesting collection of text that really does encompass so much of what is delightful about Gemara and what is interesting about this tractate in particular. And I can tell from the comments that people really connected with all these different aspects of it. So we really appreciate you. If you love learning with Dr. Osband, I can also recommend, no affiliation, but I just personally love her Talking Talmuds podcast that she does with Ann Gordon. Also a great way to learn Talmud. Though I have nothing to do with producing it. I'm just a fan. And
Thank you.
it's lovely to see you all. And we will see you in this space in 1 week's time. Thank you, Dr. Osband.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Okay, bye-bye.